EFAPCO, as an organization, is looking into different aspects of a professional life, and I believe the Transparency Code is one of the very important issues for meeting organizers. It's an issue which will have an impact on our way of organizing medical meetings, for sure. And I have to start with something what happened in the Czech Republic. A couple of years ago, there was it was actually not a pharmaceutical company, but a company which was selling and reselling medical stuff, and they did invite some Czech dermatologists to a nice holiday called conference in Egypt. And because this was publicized, and because actually in the media, on a commercial television, the only news is bad news. So this was a portrait of a meeting tourism to public. Commercial media are not that much interested in portraying the conferences, medical conferences, as a place where a huge exchange of education is taking place and positively portraying. But this kind of a little scandal was kind of a lingering in this commercial television for 3 years. And this was a very specific, this was the reason why, for instance, we in the Czech conference industry, why we tried to delete entirely from our language something what is a meeting tourism, what has this kind of negative impact, and we tried to replace it with a conference industry. So coming back to the Transparency Code, we tried to kind of decode it. And here's a quick set of slides saying what is Disclosure Code or Transparency Code explained. Why it was created: to enhance the transparency. That is clear. Who is EFPIA? We had this presentation. So if you look at the globe, it's all the places where we operate. The whole Europe is almost fully covered. Question is, who is affected? It's on one side healthcare professionals, all the doctors who receive some kind of a support for attending the meetings, for the accommodation and similar stuff, but also the healthcare organizations, typically associations which we work for. And actually, the Transparency Code even covers us as a third-party supporters of those organizations. So we have some duties within that regulation which is imposed by EFPIA. Surprisingly, when I was speaking to people from pharmaceutical industry, they said we are also affected because these duties are imposed to pharmaceutical companies. So in a sense, we are on the same boat. What is happening? Here's the definition of a transfer of value. So it's typically in our industry registration fees, travel and accommodations, or sponsorship agreement. On the side of the organizations, it's registration fees and travel and accommodation. So what is happening is actually from January 2015, all the member companies of EFPIA, all the national members, are required to collect this information for 2015, and by latest in June 2016 to publish this information on a publicly accessed site, either a national site or a website of the companies. So this is what is going to happen. So this is a big question, how it's going to affect our industry, and I can start with saying some examples. When I was talking to medical professionals about this code, some of them has voiced the fear of misinterpreting this because to general public the situation might be somehow dubious, or as I described it at commercial television, they do not fully understand the need for the education in medicine and the way how the support for the conferences goes. we've got some examples which are on a second presentation. And from a practical point of view, because this collection has already started, my own organization has been flooded with contracts now which require this support of a disclosure. So we've got a couple of examples how this goes. Sorry, I need to come back. The three sources of the concern for organizers is, first thing is the negative feedback I was already talking. And this negative feedback might create a fear where the support for meetings or attendance at the meeting might be diminished. We have already heard about some pharmaceutical companies which decided not to support registration fees or travel or an accommodation to medical meetings. Second thing, publishing support on personal level meets some legal constraints. There are some countries in Europe which have very strict privacy laws, and to have ability to publish this information, you need to have a very specific written consent from every person who is affected. And the third source of concern from a PCO side is that this exercise will have some administrative costs which are currently not covered by additional income. And sometimes these duties are pushed towards the PCOs or the organizers. So I was trying to show a couple of scenarios of a PCO engagement and the effect. So first one is a pharma company pays for participation to speaker or delegate. Some of my colleagues would say, keep this relation outside of a PCO. It's a relation between a person and a pharma company. There are some associated risks. Some pharma companies may abstain from that, and some doctors might be shy to accept this publicized support. Second situation is when pharma company supports the association. Pharma company sponsors the meeting. There might be a relation with a PCO because we act as representatives of the association. It's under contract, and we have to find the proper way how to publish it. This is relatively easy. But again, there is a little risk that some association might fear bad publicity, and the interpretation of that support needs to be properly explained. There are some difficult scenarios where there was a fear about sponsoring the social functions, and fortunately I've got the explanation that the social functions and are under certain limit, they are excluded from those payments. So the really thing which goes after, which Transparency Code goes after, is the registration fees and travel and accommodation. And second difficult scenario, sometimes pharma company sponsors the meeting as a general partner, and as a general partner, in some contracts, they might support some specific registration fees for invited people, etc. So this is something what has to be properly documented. And after kind of a first round of having interactions with pharma industry, we have seen that there are different types of contracts. Some requiring relatively easy and understandable disclosure. Some types of contracts, and it's really company per company, are trying to ask us or the medical representatives for very strictly defined consent, which is irrevocable and which is for all the lifetime, not just for 5 years publishing. So sometimes we need to actually get the right proportion, how to structure that consent, and this is something what we need to work with those pharma companies and with their national representatives and bodies, and together with EFPIA. So my recommendations from my own personal experience is the first thing to speak to medical associations and find their attitudes. Speak to your national member of EFPIA. Clarify the sponsorship contracts with clear definitions, so we are not somewhere in between. Share the best practices and avoid the need for administration of the consent agreements in a large scale. And of course, we all have to watch data protection law in our countries, because there is something where we, if not done properly, we might get into troubles. So I'll finish with the recommendations to look at the two websites, which is EFPIA EU and Pharma Disclosure EU. But probably on your national level, if you go to your national pharmaceutical association, you will see similar sites being created in your own language. And this is the end of the point of PCO view of a presentation, and I would like to open floor to questions and discussions. And I know that Mr. President has got a question which is going to be in Greek, so we will have to wait for the translation. So can you start with your question? Microphone?
Γιατί δεν ακούγομαι τώρα. Good morning, Mr. Powrie-Smith. Καλημέρα σας.
Good morning, Mr. Powrie-Smith.
From Rani, Athens. Το όνομά μου είναι Ντίνος Αστράς.
My name is Dinos Astras.
Και είμαι ο πρόεδρος του Hellenic Association of PCO. Τα τελευταία χρόνια, ο Σύνδεσμος Φαρμακευτικών Εταιριών Ελλάδας, σε συντομογραφία ΣΦΕΕ, θέσπισε ένα κώδικο δεοντολογίας, ο οποίος, αν δεν γίνει απόλυτα σεβαστός, απαγορεύει στα μέλη του χορηγούς εταιρείες να επαναλαμβάνω την τελευταία μου φράση. Ο Σύνδεσμος λοιπόν Φαρμακευτικών Εταιριών Ελλάδας τα τελευταία χρόνια θέσπισε ένα κώδικα δεοντολογίας
has implemented a code of ethics which, if fully respected, hinders its members to make any sponsorship to this conference. Some articles of this code are not implemented though, and as a result, there is a reduction, a shrinkage of different conferences at a national level by 40% at least, and many conferences have been merely cancelled. When we complained to SFE, that is the Pharma Industry Association of Greece, they told us that it should be harmonized with the code of EFPIA. So our question is the following. In your view, how should we manage this very risky, very dangerous for our job issue? Thank you very much in advance for your reply.
So I hope I picked up okay, but is the code resulting in a large and significant shrink in the support for and the number of conferences around? I think that's my understanding of the question. So so thank you for the welcome to Athens. I think that we are in a rapidly changing environment globally anyway, from a pharmaceutical perspective. It's been a very challenging few years for the industry as a whole, and we have seen a different level of budgets made available to support certain activities in pharma. We've had a patent cliff with a number of very significant medicines going off patent. And also, a financial crisis which has been perhaps unprecedented. So I think, although we can look at the disclosure code and the developments in national part of a much wider picture, where there are incredible pressures on resources now for companies, and things that used to be the case 10 years ago are just completely different now. So I think we need to recognise that we are operating in a different type of environment. I think there is also a far greater focus on how industry behaves, how it operates, and kind of how it relates to health professionals than there ever used to be in the past. And that's meant that our procedures, the compliance procedures, our codes of practice, which, again, remember, I think it's important to note, these don't come from organisations like EFPIA or associations. They come from the members of that organisation, which are the companies. That's who tells us what's to put in the code, and we then go away and work on how we do that. So the other area that I think we are, that it's worth recognising is we've seen a whole range of legislation come in from FCPA in the States, Bribery in the UK, Bertrand Law in France, a whole range of legislation that has come in and put different levels of requirements around reporting on transactions between industry or transfers of value between industry and health professionals. And one thing, by at least looking at this from a pan-European perspective, is what certainly no one wanted was an evolution where you've got 33 different sets of reporting requirements. You can imagine, as a conference organizer, trying to organize a pan-European conference where there are 33 different types of reporting. It would be near impossible to be able to manage all those different relationships. And we've seen in the US where state law applies that you can get coffee on one side, but there's a sign saying if you're from the following states you can't have it. It becomes very difficult to manage. And I think, at least if you assume or you agree that overall transparency is probably the direction of travel, then at least by creating a pan-European EFPIA code, we are able to introduce some level of consistency in what the reporting requirements are across Europe. Because if there is legislation in France, in Denmark, there is already a central platform in Holland. You've got a self-regulatory agreement in Belgium, which includes the medical devices community. You've got legislation in Slovakia. We were seeing this happen anyway. So actually, if you can get some consistency in that relationship, then particularly for those organising pan-European events, it may over time actually be somewhat of a support if this actually was happening anyway, but in a much more kind of fragmented way. I would recognise absolutely that it presents challenges for people. we see that, we talk to people constantly, and we understand that. And I think if you add those challenges to some of the difficult things that the environment as a whole is facing, then we realise that causes some pressures. But we are in an industry that evolves and changes constantly, and I think this is part of that process.
Thank you, Andy, for that answer. You've got another question from the floor. Sorry, Mr. President is continuing.
Hello? Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. So I'm going to a direct question, and the question is the National Code of Ethics of the National Association of Pharmaceutical Companies more powerful than the EFPIA Code? So if the National Association...
That's a great question.
And that is actually the question of our President. If we accept their reply on our questions that we harmonize with the EFPIA Code, but if it's a fact that the national code is more powerful, actually. Thank you.
So, so listen, I joined EFPIA from a national association, so I'm very familiar with this question. So, a condition of membership of EFPIA for a national association is the alignment of their codes. So they have the opportunity to go further than EFPIA can, but the baseline is the EFPIA code, and it's a condition of membership of EFPIA for companies, but significantly for national associations that manage the code of practice, that their code is aligned to the EFPIA code. So we would view it as complementary rather than who is more or less powerful. I think in reality there is a sort of more significant implementation responsibility and in practical day-to-day terms from the National Association Code. That's where often complaints are generated. That's where there is the processes to manage those complaints and so on. But in terms of, could there be a big variance in codes, and if that was the case, which one would win through? That's not likely to be the case, because the condition of membership of EFPIA as a national association to be part of that European-wide family is alignment of the code. The exception is where they decide that they want to go further. So they want to be more stringent, then that's possible. EFPIA is, in a sense, the baseline. And the other area is where legislation is in place that means there needs to be a different approach. So if we took, France, for example, then obviously the Bertrand law in there has some slightly different requirements to those in the EFPIA code, more stringent. But companies, of course, local law takes precedence there over the self-regulatory environment. So I hope that answers the question.
If I may add one more information from, for instance, Czech point of view, I'm not entirely happy with having to implement this transparency code because it brings additional work and brings some constraints. But on the other hand, if I'm comparing it to some proposals for limiting the advertising and the support of medical conferences through a law, which some group of Czech members of parliament was proposing, this limitation in the law was much stricter and actually requiring a lot of reporting and requiring reporting, actually putting accounts of all the sponsorship within 10 days after closing the Congress into the hands of a semi-ministerial organization under the big fines. If I compare this proposal of very strict law, which would clearly lead to effectively banning the sponsorship, or actually bringing very much difficulties to sponsorship with a transparency code, I would very much opt for the transparency code, which gives us still some place to breathe. And if we work together and if we somehow are able to make it right, that would be kind of a protection from these crazy ideas of some politicians might have.
You raise a very good point, Miksa, because it's easy to see a code up there and and sort of criticize the content of that code. I've done it. We've all done it. That's a fairly simple process. What's much more difficult is to sort of understand what could have happened if that code was not in place. And as we saw the emergence of legislation, as you say, some pretty difficult to cope with ideas from politicians that had, seen the Sunshine Act or responding to things in the media, then we could have ended up with a far more fragmented and in places far more onerous, work-intensive systems, different right across Europe, as opposed to at least some kind of consistency of approach that we have had, that we've been able to shape and kind of design with member companies. So I think, what would have happened if we had not done that is obviously very difficult to prove or understand, but actually is quite a big issue.
We've got one more comment from the floor.
Sure.
Yep.
Yes, my last question, Mr. Powrie-Smith. In case we cannot solve our problems with the society of the pharmaceutical companies in Greece, can we apply to EFPIA seeking for support?
So yeah, I mean, I would say what our aim here is to ensure, as best we possibly can, the successful implementation of the code across Europe. If there's an area where there is a significant issue that's making that's very difficult to address, then there is a degree of technical expertise, compliance, legal expertise at EFPIA that in a supportive way and in conversation with our member associations, we can try and support that process.
Perfect. Thank you, Andy. And I believe that kind of a conclusion from what we have as a part of a discussion here is that we have to communicate. We have to communicate with our clients. We have to communicate with our sponsors and supporters in the pharma industry. Thank you very much for your offer to come wherever it's necessary or significant to support the discussion and a proper implementation. And thank you very much for your presentation. So
that was a pleasure. Thank you very much for the invite, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And I'm slightly upset I'm in Scotland and not Athens.
It's raining here, so maybe next time.
Thank you, Miksa.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, enjoy the rest of the conference, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.